Perfect. Right. So, welcome and thank you, Kylie, and everybody else, as I say, if you haven't already done so, mute yourself. I'll mute myself, and we'll enjoy the conversation.
Best unmute myself. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about the Aboriginal ageing research we've been doing here at NeuRA over the last few years. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking from Aboriginal land. So this is the land of the Gadigal and the Bidjigal people here in the NeuRA Nation in Sydney, and I have great respect for the local elders and their ancestors. So today I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've been doing in Indigenous ageing here in New South Wales, and it's centred mainly around the Koori Growing Old Well study, KGOWS, as Matthew said. Okay, so to start with, I just thought I'd give you a bit of background about ageing in Indigenous Australians, especially for people who don't have much experience in Indigenous health research. So we often think of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population as a relatively young population. And it's true to say, if you look at this graph here on the right-hand side, where the blue bars show the Indigenous population, there are a lot of young people there at the bottom of the chart, and relatively fewer people in the older age groups. And this is quite a different pattern from the non-Indigenous population, which is shown there in the sort of orangey bars. So the proportion of people aged 65 and older in the Indigenous population is currently 3.4%, and this is quite a bit lower than the 14% that you would see in the non-Indigenous population. But the fact is that there's quite a lot of evidence accumulating that the Indigenous population is also ageing. So this proportion above 65 is projected to almost double in the next 20 years. And we've seen, even in our sort of study and monitoring the census counts in this area, a big increase over 5 years in the number of older Aboriginal people in the communities that we work with. And importantly, I think, at older ages, so once you get to 60, 65, your life expectancy as an Indigenous person becomes much closer to a non-Indigenous person. So that gap narrows as people get older. And I think at age 65, the gap in life expectancy is about 6 years, which is compared to the overall average, which is currently about 10 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Now, this chart here shows you the distribution of the population, the Indigenous population, by state and by remoteness. And I guess the reason I'm showing this, and the main things I want you to take away from it, is that most of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of Australia live in non-remote areas. So these are the dark and light blue and the brown sort of sections that you can see on the chart. The pink and the sort of yellow-orange colour is the remote population, which represents about 21% of the overall Indigenous population of Australia. So the vast majority of people are living in urban and regional areas, major cities and regional areas. And New South Wales, as you can see here, which is the first bar and the widest bar, has the largest population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of any state or territory. Queensland's not far behind. But in New South Wales, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up a relatively small proportion of the overall state population. So it's just 3%. And this contrasts quite strikingly with somewhere like the Northern Territory, where the Indigenous population is closer to 30% of the total population. So this sort of small proportion of the population also gives rise to some challenges, I guess, in relation to conducting population-based research with older Aboriginal people in urban and regional areas. Now, in Indigenous health research in general, there are a number of sort of considerations or criteria at the heart of the research. And this is really important, I think, and probably should be insisted upon in a lot of other populations. And we're seeing a little bit of a move towards that with more consumer involvement in a lot of research. But for Indigenous health research, these criteria have been established for some time now and really guide the way that we plan and conduct research with Aboriginal communities. So these include things like community engagement and Aboriginal control of research. The research needs to have some benefit for the Aboriginal communities involved. There needs to be no financial burden or costs affecting participants or their communities for participating in the research. And the benefits need to be sustainable and hopefully transferable to other contexts and communities as well. And importantly, we need to have a focus on building capability or enhancing skills and knowledge within the communities that we work with. And I think that we've been quite successful in achieving that through KGALS. Our study is based on very close partnerships with organisations, health organisations and other Aboriginal controlled organisations within the communities that we work in. And this includes a formal partnership, formal agreements to collaborate, as well as the formation of local guidance group, which usually include 3 or 4 local elders who work quite closely with us and giving us advice in terms of how we sort of plan and produce our research protocols, how these are piloted, and the general sort of conduct of the research in the communities. We also have a lot of Aboriginal involvement in terms of the researchers involved in the study, right from the chief investigator level down to those working out in the field. And in each community for our studies, we've employed a local Aboriginal research assistant who works alongside a non-Indigenous researcher to collect the data and conduct the fieldwork involved in the study. And I'd say that this has been perhaps the most essential part of the success of our study is this local Aboriginal person, their knowledge and networks and their capacity to engage with the community around them. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there are some methodological challenges, I guess, that affect probably urban research in urban communities more so than in remote areas, and that really stems from this kind of low proportion of the total population. So while there are large numbers of Aboriginal people in New South Wales, they're very much sort of interspersed within the wider community. So the conventional methods, I guess, for conducting population-based research aren't available to Okay, good. I'll keep going. So the conventional methods include things like taking a random sample from the electoral roll or going and knocking on everyone's door within a particular suburb, and those just weren't feasible or practical for our study. So the starting point really for our study was to conduct our own census of the local population, and this in itself was quite a challenge. We worked very closely with our community partner organisations to have a sort of basic, I guess, list of people in the community who access their services. But as you would probably know from other types of research, these kinds of lists aren't always complete, or they may not be completely up to date. And as we found, a lot of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people as well, a lot of people choose not to use Aboriginal controlled services in their community. So it's not a complete representation of community. So an important part of our census was to try and snowball these lists. And this is where our local Aboriginal researchers really had a very strong contribution to the research. And the other approach we took to snowballing was simply to ask participants as well if they knew any other older Aboriginal people in their community. So our census was really aiming to find out how many older Aboriginal people aged 60 years and older, were living in the communities in which we were working. And because of this snowballing technique, the census process was really proceeding in parallel with the actual data collection and research at the same time. So we didn't know, I guess, what our total population base was until we'd really finished the study and had that final census count. So I've been alluding a little bit to the Career Growing Old Well study, but I think it's time I told you a bit more about the details of it. So as I mentioned, we were working in New South Wales. We partnered with 5 Aboriginal communities, and for the purposes of the research, we had to have define some geographical boundaries around those communities, and we used local government area boundaries, and that enabled us to compare our population census with the counts available through the ABS and their population census counts. So these communities included the Gabanji and Damgeti people up in the mid-north coast of New South Wales, which encompass the Coffs Harbour, Nambucca and Kempsey LGAs. And then down around Sydney, we worked with the La Perouse Aboriginal community, so centred around La Perouse, but taking in Randwick and Botany LGAs as well, and also the Tharawal people out around the Campbelltown LGA. Now, the aims of the Career Growing Old Well study were firstly to determine the prevalence of cognitive impairment and dementia in Aboriginal Australians aged 60 years and older. We also wanted to assess the validity and sort of relative performance of different cognitive screening tools for dementia in this population. We wanted to examine the factors that were associated with dementia and cognitive impairment. We wanted to look closely at the use of formal dementia and aged care services in the communities, and also the burden of dementia on family caregivers. And finally, we aim to build some capacity in dementia assessment and care in the communities. So this is the design of our study, and as you can see at the top, we've completed our census, and the total population was 546 people. Of those people, 336 people agreed to participate, which was fantastic. So that's about a 61% response rate out of the total population. Now, those people were primarily identified as Aboriginal. We had 2 people identify as Torres Strait Islander and 6 as who identified as both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So when I refer to the study as an Aboriginal population, it's because it's very much involves Aboriginal people, although the study was open to both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So just to make sure that's clear. The people who participated were aged 60, between 60 and 92 years of age was the oldest, although most people were in their 60s. So 73% of our sample were younger than 70 years of age. 60% were female, and nearly everybody spoke English as a first language. The average years of education in our group was around 9 years. So this is quite different to previous ageing research that had been done in remote Aboriginal communities, where you saw a lot higher proportion of people with no formal education, up to 40%, and also a range of different traditional languages were spoken, and often English wasn't spoken or wasn't a first language. So it's quite a bit of a different population in a regional and urban area. Now, just to walk you through what happened in the study, the procedure, all these participants, 336 participants, undertook a comprehensive survey of their social history and their health history across their whole lifespan. So it took a couple of hours to complete this structured interview. And the interview also included some cognitive screening tests for dementia. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the cognitive screening tests today, but just to let you know that we had quite stringent criteria in terms of how people performed on these tests, and these were developed through pilot testing. We had an initial pilot study with about 30 people to sort of I guess, iron out the measures that we were using and the way we were asking the questions, and also to determine what level was appropriate in terms of cognitive screening cutoffs for the study. So very stringent. For people who were scoring very high on all three of the measures that we were using, most of them ended their study participation there. But we selected a 20% random sample of those high scoring people to continue on to the next study stage. And then we also had what turned out to be 171 people, so about half the sample, who scored below these stringent cutoffs on any one of the three measures. So it was quite, I guess a very sort of rigorous process in terms of screening people out. And all those people were then invited to attend a medical assessment with a geriatrician. And from that, the information from these medical assessments were reviewed by a consensus panel, and that included at least three clinicians, and always at least one geriatrician and one neuropsychologist. And that panel would determine the diagnosis of dementia or cognitive impairment that are the main outcomes of this study. So aim one was dementia prevalence, and this chart shows you the rates of dementia across our study in the blue bars compared to other populations in the red and the green bars. So the overall prevalence in our sample, in our cohort, was 13.4%. And when we take into consideration the relatively young ages, most people in their 60s of this sample, it equates to an age standardised prevalence rate of 21%, which compares to 6.8% in the total Australian population. So it's about 3 times higher, the rates of dementia in the age group 60 years and over. Our study was also quite similar in terms of the results compared to a previous study by Kate Smith and her colleagues in the remote Kimberley region of Western Australia in showing these high rates of dementia. So the remote results are shown in the red bars. KGAU's results in urban and region areas are shown in the blue bars, and you can see that in all these age groups, they're much higher than the estimates for the general Australian population in these ages. And at younger ages, you're seeing results that are about 4 to 5 times higher than the general Australian population, and about 2 to 3 times higher in these older age groups. The types of dementia that were diagnosed in our study were primarily Alzheimer's disease at 44% of the total number of people with dementia. Vascular dementia was the next common diagnosis, and this is quite similar to, I guess, a number of older populations and studies that have been done around the world. We did see a large number of mixed dementia diagnoses, so 29% there, which reflects the often very complex clinical presentation that people had, and the difficulty in I guess describing an exact cause of dementia in this group. So a lot of these people in the mixed dementia group also had a diagnosis of possible Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease seems to be very common, but given these rates of different contributing factors, including head injury, high rates of head injury, vascular pathology, so stroke, as well as ischemic heart disease, and also some links with sort of alcohol use in the past, it's quite difficult to say 100% for sure what's causing dementia in this population. But we think it's largely Alzheimer's disease, but this needs to be further investigated You'll see also that there was a proportion with dementia due to head trauma, and sort of one person here with diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. What was different, I guess, between the expected pattern of dementia and what we saw was that vascular dementia wasn't perhaps as common as we might have expected, and also it had been previously assumed that alcohol would be contributing to a lot of cases of dementia. But we didn't really see many cases of alcohol-related dementia in this study at all. It was quite rare, in fact, and that might be because it's an older population. But in the remote study, where the age group was 45 and over, you also saw this low impact, I guess, of alcohol-related dementia. Just going to show you a little bit of data now about the factors that are associated with dementia in urban and regional Aboriginal people. And we have a lot of data on different potential risk factors and protective factors. So I had to be a bit selective in the ones I'm showing you today. Mostly I've chosen them based on those that were found to be associated with dementia in remote Aboriginal people, to compare that. And also to think about the factors that are potentially modifiable in this population. So there was a study a few years back that you might be familiar with by Barnes and Yaff, a meta-analysis that concluded that probably about 50% of the cases of Alzheimer's disease worldwide were attributable to modifiable risk factors. And the key factors they found there were things like low education, smoking, physical inactivity, and depression. And what interests me, I guess, is that a lot of this burden of dementia that we're seeing in Aboriginal communities could be preventable or modifiable as well. There is research out there that describes the sort of Indigenous health gap, which again is largely attributable to things like physical inactivity, smoking, and obesity. So there's a sort of overlap in this pattern of risk factors, I guess, for Alzheimer's disease and the types of health problems that are affecting Indigenous peoples. So the results here on the screen show clearly, and we saw it in the previous slide, that age is definitely associated with dementia. So increasing age, increasing prevalence of dementia. In contrast to the remote study, research done in remote populations, male gender and a low education level aren't quite as strong. They're sort of borderline associated, I guess, with dementia in this population. But once we control for age, those associations are no longer significant. This slide shows you a whole range of other potential risk factors. I should give you the caveat up front that these really need to be explored or investigated further in longitudinal research before we can confirm them. But in our sort of cross-sectional study, we are seeing some associations, and they do correspond with risk factors that have been found in previous studies for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So we wanted to look at potential risk factors across the whole lifespan as well. So not just those in sort of mid or later life, but stemming right from childhood. And we looked at the childhood trauma questionnaire. So this is about childhood abuse and neglect rather than about traumatic brain injury, which sometimes people confuse it with. So we've shown that those that experience more childhood trauma were also more likely to be diagnosed with dementia in our cohort. Those who had reported high levels of alcohol use in the past were also more likely to be diagnosed with dementia in our sample. And we used, to screen for alcohol use, we used the Audit-C, which is a very brief sort of screening measure. Current alcohol use was not associated with dementia, but we asked people to respond to this screening tool according to the time of their life when they were drinking the most, and this was associated with Depression wasn't associated with dementia in childhood. This is true for both lifetime history of depression as well as sort of current symptoms of depression. But the things that were associated with dementia were previous stroke or TIA, previous head injury with loss of consciousness and epilepsy, and all of these things have quite a higher prevalence within the Aboriginal population, and were also found to be associated with dementia in the remote Aboriginal population as well. So we think that these things are obviously very important in terms of understanding these high rates of dementia. Diabetes and hypertension I've just included there as additional health indicators, I guess. They're known to be highly prevalent in Aboriginal populations, and that's sort of borne out here in the results. I think they could also be important contributing factors for dementia, but perhaps our measures in this study aren't sensitive enough. So we're asking about just a history, a diagnosis of diabetes or hypertension. But what could be more important is about the relative management and control of these chronic diseases over time in terms of how they contribute to dementia. So just to summarise the results of the Career Growing Old Well study, the number of older and the proportion of older Aboriginal people is increasing rapidly. Most Aboriginal Australians live in urban and regional or non-remote parts of the country. The burden of dementia is high, so it's at least 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians, and that's now being consistent across Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and in New South Wales. Alzheimer's dementia appears to be the most common cause of dementia, but I think this needs to be investigated further so we understand a bit more the role of Alzheimer's disease compared to other pathologies in this high burden of dementia. There are lots of social and biomedical risk factors, potential risk factors across the lifespan that we need to further explore within our data. I've just presented a few of them today, but it shows that childhood adversity, along with midlife health and lifestyle factors, appear to be contributing to these higher rates of dementia. And one thing that I haven't had a chance to show you today, just because of time, is that there are also many positive factors in these communities. And I think this is going to be important when we look towards dementia prevention and ways to capitalise or make the most of these positive factors. And this includes things like social connectedness. So a lot of older Aboriginal people report very strong ties to their community. They're seeing people every day that don't live with them. They have people that are there to care for them and look after them. And the other side is that older Aboriginal people are rating themselves as highly resilient, so very able to adapt to stress and sort of cope with change. Now, just going back to our Indigenous research criteria, part of the process needs to focus on benefit for Aboriginal communities and sort of building capacity and skills within those communities as a result of the research. And we've had 2 projects that have been focused on knowledge translation in the 5 communities that we've worked with. The first is the Career Dementia Care project, and this has been probably over the last 5 years been happening, and it has involved mentoring and upskilling local Aboriginal workers in dementia knowledge and care, and also facilitating a relationship between these Aboriginal workers and sort of local non-Indigenous health services to enhance the cultural sensitivity and the way that these services engage and with the Aboriginal communities in which they're based. We've also been able to establish some geriatric specialist outreach clinics in each of the communities, which has been really, really valuable. I think certainly as the studies progress, the awareness of ageing and dementia and sort of related issues has increased quite dramatically within the communities, and there's a corresponding, I guess, need for these geriatric services, which we've been lucky enough to be able to help establish. And the second component of our knowledge translation is a project. Well, it's actually just starting. It's something I'm going to be getting my teeth into over the next few years. It's called the Korea Active and Healthy Aging Project. And this is really focused on dementia prevention. So we want to take what we've learned about the risk and protective factors for aging, successful aging and dementia through our epidemiological research, and start translating that into some strategies for dementia prevention in the future. And to do that, we're going to be working very closely and consulting with older Aboriginal people. And in the second half of the project, we'll be testing out some of the strategies that we develop in collaboration. But I think in future there's going to be need a lot more scope, I guess, for dementia prevention across the whole lifespan and engaging with younger people as well. Now, before I finish, and I think I've got time, I just wanted to read to you something that was written from an Aboriginal perspective on dementia. Unfortunately, I was unable to have a co-presenter here today, so we did have someone in mind, but it just didn't work out. But I think it's very important to include Aboriginal voices in, wherever we can in the research. They should always be there. And this image you can see on the right here was some artwork that was commissioned by the Korea Dementia Care Project to help raise awareness and education of dementia in the communities. It was created by an Aboriginal artist from La Perouse here called Mary Page. And I'd just like to read you her words describing this image, because I think it's a wonderful insight into a different perspective on dementia, and it has also been a very powerful tool for the Korea Dementia Care Project in terms of engaging both Aboriginal people and sort of non-Indigenous clinicians and researchers in this conversation about dementia in Aboriginal communities. So these are Mary's words. In the middle part of the brain is a black spot, which is the first sign of dementia, and it spreads like a vortex through the other brain cells. The rest of the black around the brain is the other cells dying, and the silver represents the minimum of brain tissue that is left. The red shapes represent the blood flow, the blood cells, and the veins. There are slight greens in there, which to me is always to do with mentality that acts like a calming. Also in the centre of the brain is the eye of the mind. We are all born with the eye of the mind, and we will all die with the eye of the mind. It's just part of our existence. The eye will always be there, even in sickness. The tracks in the top right and lower left-hand corners symbolise the memory leaving the brain. Black in the background is the death of the brain tissues. Everything's gone, and that's where it goes to when it dies. It symbolises loneliness and how the person feels with dementia. We don't know where it goes to, and that is what we are hoping to find out. The flowers represent hope, hoping one day there will be a cure for dementia. The red in the flowers is strength and power, because we must have the strength and the power to have hope. The gold also means strength, and it signifies the sun, hoping that the sunlight comes in and that there will be a brighter day for those people suffering from dementia. So I think that says it all. To finish up, I'd just like to acknowledge the vast numbers of people that have been involved in this project, and especially to say thanks to all our study volunteers. Thank you.
Liam Flicker is on. Liam Flicker is on. It's in this room.
There's any questions on now?
Thank you very much for that, Kylie. That was really, really interesting. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the little bit of interference we were getting in the middle there. Yeah, I know, guys, it was at your end. You had two connections running for some reason, so there was feedback happening. But obviously your tech guy realised it part way and turned one of them off. So really, really pleased. So what I might do is I'll ask my first question, and then we'll open it up to the room. But as I say, can each of you, when you ask a question, just explain where you're from, and we'll go from there. So mine actually gets to that 61% consent, which I'm incredibly jealous of. And you mentioned that prior to even getting consent, you needed to do a census, and obviously the census was an engagement activity, which pumped your consent rate up. How is that consent rate comparable to other Indigenous ageing or just Indigenous health research? It seems remarkably good.
Well, I think that in general, the processes that you go through in just really starting the research or planning the research, there's a lot of engagement at that stage. So before you actually get to that sort of data collection point where you're seeking sort of consent from participants, there's been a long history of working with the communities. There's been, I guess, people becoming aware of the study and what you're doing. You've probably been presenting it at different community forums, and so sort of people know about it. And to be successful, it's designed with in consultation with the communities as well. So it's sort of addressing a need, or it's being conducted in a way that people are behind and are supporting in the first place. In terms of how this fares in comparison to other Indigenous health research, I know they had a very high response rate with their ageing study in the remote Kimberley region. So this you might have referred to as the kicker studies. I think this was actually quite a bit higher than what we've achieved, which was remarkable. And I think that part of that goes with having working in a remote area where a large proportion of the population or that you're working with, or in the area that you're working with, is sort of involved in the study and behind the study. So it's sort of easier, I guess, to get that reach in a way in terms of connecting with people. How it compares to other Indigenous health research, I don't actually know, and that's a really good question. I mean, I guess a lot of the research I look at often comes from kind of data linkage studies or sort of retrospective data collection through health service access and that kind of thing. It's a good question, and I will look it up. I'd be interested to know, for instance, a lot of the statistics that I draw on come from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and what their response rate is to the surveys that they base those statistics on.
Okay. All right. I've got a whole page of questions, but I'll be polite. Who wants to ask the next question? Just say something. Otherwise, I'll ask the next question. All right. Go for it, Sydney.
Hi. I'm Sharon Thorpe from Sydney University.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi. So, Kylie, I was interested to hear that you said that, you set up some Aboriginal workers with mentors, with allied health professionals and that. Has that been evaluated, or, is there some information about that? Because I'm really interested in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely send you something. One thing I did omit to do was to put my email address up on the slides.
Okay.
But if anybody, across the board wants any further information, you can just email me. It's k.radford@neura.edu.au. So,
Right.
the website for NeuRA is on the slides, and you can find me through that way as well. I'd be very happy to send you anything.
Yes.
There was an article published, I think it's in 2014 now, by Sharon Wall, who's been the coordinator of the Koori Dementia Care Project. And she was a dementia CNC in a previous life, and has a long history of working in dementia education and care. And she coordinated the project, and she worked very closely with Aboriginal workers. And primarily it sort of flowed on from our epidemiological studies. So we retained a lot of the local Aboriginal researchers that we'd been working with, and then they participated in the Career Dementia Care project. And so through that, Sharon worked with them to help them develop more skills and knowledge in terms of dementia and the services, and just awareness, I guess, about causes and the sort of effects on families and caregivers. And then the idea was to mentor them to be, as I guess, a resource within their communities as well. And it was sort of an evolving project. So it was funded by the Department of Disability and Aged Care as just purely a knowledge translation project. So it wasn't a research study as such. So there's not a lot of, I guess, stats or data in terms of evaluation. And it did sort of evolve in terms of the different communities that we were working with. So there wasn't a like one size fits all kind of into how it was working. It was really up to this sort of what were often called the dementia knowledge holder. So this local Aboriginal person who'd been sort of mentored in dementia knowledge and care, and the way that they sort of planned that project out. So often it involved sort of talking to non-Indigenous health service providers and working a bit more closely with them to understand, you know, who are the Aboriginal people in the area that need these services or aren't accessing these services. What are the kind of issues involved when you're approaching and working with an Aboriginal person with dementia that might be different? There was a big emphasis on utilising, a lot of resources have been already developed around dementia in Aboriginal communities. So the idea was to help promote those kind of existing resources. And I know they worked very closely with Alzheimer's Australia in the Mid-North Coast to sort of distribute and promote some of those resources that were already available. Some new resources were also produced. I think there was a DVD done with the HAC service in the Southwest.
Oh, that'd be good to see.
Yeah. Basically, sorry, I'm going on and on and on, but basically Sharon's article, which was in the Australian Journal of Dementia Care, and I can forward you a copy.
That'd be wonderful.
Because all the things that they were involved in.
I think it's like really, you know, because we set up some, you know, mentoring partnerships in Victoria when I was down there between, you know, dietitians and the Aboriginal health worker and that. And, you know, it was proved to be very successful. And it was based on, you know, like, and it was a two-way learning. So that allied health professional was learning a lot about community stuff as well, you know, cultural stuff and that.
Yes.
And, you know, vice versa, the health worker was learning about, you know, clinical stuff, and it proved to be very successful. So that's why I was interested to, you know, I'd love to hear more about it eventually.
Okay.
Thank
Next
you.
question. All right. I'll ask my next one then. You mentioned in terms of the census that you ended up having to do yourself, that part of that was because of the challenge of relying on actual ABS census data for these sorts of communities. Has there been any discussion back to the ABS about the potential to do more targeted work to get the more accurate numbers?
Well, I think that actually, I mean, the ABS is already onto this in a lot of ways. I mean, I think they have been criticised in the past for, I guess, underestimating the Indigenous population and not including Indigenous people in the census process. And in recent years, I think they've worked hard to change that, and they've sort of focused a little bit more on, you know, how they roll out the census and promote the census within Indigenous communities. And I know that they've also, since we've done the study and we had to use a local government area, they're also defining sort of Indigenous community areas or large populations of Indigenous people to sort of to focus the census around and the rollout of some of those census activities. So I can't remember if I actually said it in the study or in my talk or not, but there was, I mean, just from the 2006 census, this is the ABS census, to the 2011 census, there was a huge increase in the number of Aboriginal people or people identifying as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in that census. And I'm sure there's a number of factors that go into that, including, you know, people willing to identify or the actual population increasing. But part of that, I think, is just the reach of the census itself and the sort of, I guess, the measures they've taken to be a bit more proactive in including Aboriginal people in those counts.
The reason I asked the question is I was at a meeting yesterday with my local council as part of a positive ageing group, and they had a presenter there talking about the census coming up in August, and that the ABS is targeting an 80% online completion rate, and that they're hoping for the next census 5 years after that to be 100% online. That would be interesting for some of these communities. So obviously they have to have alternative approaches, you would hope, but to say 100% online doesn't sound optimistic.
Yeah, actually, that will be quite. I mean, everybody's getting the internet, and it's becoming much more widespread. And things like that, use of technology with Aboriginal people is, I think at the sort of forefront of healthcare at the moment. So it is useful, but yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I guess the challenge for us over and above the ABS is that we weren't just taking a census of everyone in the area, and we also needed to be able to contact people to invite them to participate in the study. So we needed to know, names and addresses and telephone numbers, and that relied a lot more on sort of being out in the field for our Aboriginal researchers and sort of connecting with people and finding out that information. You might have to, somebody might know, somebody lives over on that street, but I don't know which house it is. So you'd have to have a drive past and check the house number and so that then you'd have all those details to be able to contact people. So yeah, it was a bit more involved than what like an ABS census necessarily needs to be.
Okay.
Can I just add something? It's Claire Coleman here from the Sydney Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistics, and we've had some meetings with the ABS around the census, and they have two different strategies. There is a remote strategy, none of which will be online, and it will be community facilitated, and they're doing a thorough evaluation of the impact of the online census for Aboriginal people within the urban areas as well. So they're not going into this completely blind as to the effects that it may have. I think we can relax a little bit around that online take-up.
Well, certainly here one of the comments made was that for the next online version, you cannot do it on a smartphone because the census is simply too big to be able to manage it on a little screen. And there was a comment made about the local Indigenous community that the vast majority of them are because I'm in a sort of you define my area as, I'm in Gippsland in country Victoria, which is probably regional, but for me feels like outer urban because Melbourne's only an hour away. The comment was made that the Indigenous community here, which isn't that big, but almost all of them only use smartphones for their internet access. They don't have computers at home. So it's going to be really interesting to shape these approaches to make sure we get proper representation. Anala, I think someone there was going to say something. Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Matthew. This is Prabha. I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
We can. And really pleased to have you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for letting us be able to connect from... Say that again.
Maybe let people just know where you're at, because we haven't had you on an era.
Okay. Yeah. So we're from Inala Indigenous Health Service, which is a primary healthcare clinic, and we serve Inala, which is a suburb in Brisbane, and it has a very high Indigenous population. Okay. So we serve the community here. And I'm a senior research officer here. Audrey is with me. She works as a case manager with a number of our older Aboriginal patients. So I thank you for letting us connect from our workplace, because we do have video conferencing facilities here, services, and we would not have been able to get to UQ to attend otherwise. So my specialty is dementia and aged care. So Kylie, the presentation was really great. My question was, you used a number of tools, the MMSE, the MKICA and also the RUDASH for assessing the patients for positive or negative dementia. Did you use all three of them was my question. And also if you did some validation, how did you find the three tools?
Yeah. So we did use all three. So one of the aims that we were funded for was to compare the tools to see which was the most appropriate or the most, I guess, the most reliable, the most effective in an urban and regional population. That's been published now, and I didn't have, because of the time limits, I couldn't sort of go into that in much detail. But basically, we found that they perform quite similarly. If you look at their sort of receiver operating characteristic curves, there wasn't a significant difference between those three tools. If anything, I think that the MMSE and MKICA was slightly better in terms of their sensitivity and specificity. And I should just probably got a slide here in front of me just so I can give you some accurate results.
Actually, Kylie would be interested in if you had, is the paper published or in?
It is, yeah. So it's published.
Accepted.
Yeah, it's published. It was published last year in the Journal of Dementia and Geriatric Cognitive Disorders, and with me as the first author. So that gives you
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Next question. All right, I'll go back in again. You talked about that slide with the risk factors, and you can see some of them came close in terms of the intervals and so on. But you found that childhood trauma was associated with dementia. And as you said, it's not acquired brain injury; it's psychological trauma.
Psychological trauma, yeah.
So, what do they think the causal pathway might be there? Is there any discussion about that in the literature?
Well, I suppose there's a number of there's a lot of discussion, in short. There are a number of potential causal pathways, and I guess that it all sort of hinges on it being this sort of important period in terms of growth and development, and how that might then affect later sort of brain reserve or resilience against some of these pathologies that start to accumulate in later life. Some studies in childhood of some neuroimaging studies have shown that children are exposed to these kind of adverse environments. So it could be through sort of abuse or neglect that the childhood trauma questionnaire measures, or it could be things like institutionalization and this is in certain sort of European countries. But you see that structurally there are differences in the ways that the brains of these children are developing. So they have a reduced volume in sort of frontal lobe areas, and they also have a corresponding sort of reduction in executive skills and the cognitive functions, I guess, that are associated with those brain areas. So there's this sort of structural component in terms of the way the brain is growing, and probably in terms of not just in terms of volume, but in terms of the connections and the way that it's functioning as well. The other theory, I guess, that goes more, which is more specific, I guess, to the psychological aspect of it, is what they call the hypothalamic pituitary axis theory. So I guess in this developmental stage, the way that your sort of response to stress and adversity is changing and becoming, I guess, in a way hardwired to be the way that you respond to stress and adversity later on in life. So it's this sort of heightened sensitivity in a way, and I guess the vulnerability to dementia and aging is the effect that this heightened stress response has across your lifespan in terms of the stress hormones that are released, the cortisol, and the damage that they might have on structures like the hippocampus.
So that leads into where you ended up in your presentation, because there you're talking about the potential childhood long-term impacts. And now you're looking at the next study, which is a prevention study. What sort of age group are you looking at focusing on to then try and prevent the development of the dementia?
Yeah, well, it's hard. I think in terms of the study that I'm planning, it will be mainly working with older Aboriginal people, and that will be from ages 50 and over, so a bit younger than what we've included in our study. And that will sort of work around some of the risk factors in later life that are potentially preventable. And also, it's all up in the air in terms of what will actually happen, because it really needs to be worked out in collaboration with the community members. But some of the things that we're hoping to do is to use some of the recent research that shows the improvement in terms of cognitive function and sort of neuroplasticity that come with physical exercise and some cognitive exercises as well, to try and incorporate that in as a dementia prevention kind of strategy within a wider general healthy aging kind of promotion thing. But I think in the long term, to really have a strong impact on these sort of dementia rates, it has to start sort of earlier. And I think that the earlier the better in terms of population prevention. And I mean, it's not just specific to dementia either. I mean, it's a wider problem, I think, within Indigenous health, that there are a lot of points along the whole lifespan that are contributing to this sort of gap in health and life expectancy.
So we're seeing a 60-year NHMRC proposal.
Yeah, it's not going to happen, is it? But maybe we can, look at little snippets along the way.
So another research question on the topic of the NHMRC, you mentioned the AHMRC and the NHMRC. What's the overlap? I've not really heard that much about, because I don't work in this space, about the AHMRC.
Okay, so
how are they connected or not?
Best of my knowledge, the AHMRC is completely independent of the NHMRC, so they have a similar name, but the AHMRC is completely Aboriginal controlled, and it's does a lot of things in terms of health research for Indigenous people. So there are a lot of, if you go to their website, there are a lot of resources. They're involved in a lot of projects themselves, but they also have an ethics committee, which in New South Wales at least is responsible for reviewing all research that involves Aboriginal people, targets Aboriginal people, whatever.
Yeah. And sorry, Kylie, so it's Sharon Thorpe again.
Oh, Sharon, please correct me if I'm giving it.
Yeah, so the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, so they're the peak body for Aboriginal health in New South Wales. And also they're under the they're under the ethics guidelines for NHMRC. But so any researchers that are doing any research on Aboriginal people, especially when with Aboriginal health, they must get ethics from the AHMRC ethics.
But only in New South Wales.
Yes, only New South Wales. Other states, I think there's South Australia, have an Aboriginal ethics committee.
Okay.
And somewhere else, but only.
Sorry guys, that's the Inala group who popped off and came back on, but we're getting feedback again. So I've just muted you in Inala. So apologies. If you want to ask another question, you'll have to unmute yourself. All right. Anything more? Because I'm probably hogging the questions here. So it's been a really interesting discussion and a really wide variety of participants. So I'm really pleased. Probably my last question, I'll be greedy. Why the two coastal areas for K-Gals?
Why are they only on the coast?
Yeah. I was born near one of those, and you didn't include my area, so I'm a little bit offended.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, there are certainly other sort of very large Aboriginal communities in other parts of New South Wales. You're right. the fact is that most Aboriginal people will live on the eastern coastline, so sort of down the east coast of Queensland and New South Wales. So there's large numbers there. But in reality, in terms of the way our study was set up, we were hoping to have more communities involved, but out in the sort of western part, so inland of New South Wales, but within the time frame of our funding and what was feasible, some of those sites just didn't get off the ground, which is unfortunate. And it would be wonderful to include more of those communities in our research in future, and which hopefully we will, because I guess a lot of the groundwork's already done. It just never happened for this particular study. So that is a gap, I think, that in terms of how well these results translate to other communities. And I know that there are a number of other studies that are in the pipeline or just beginning now to look at ageing and dementia in different Indigenous populations, and I think that's important.
But it also raises the topic of the pragmatics of research. You can have a perfect research design, but in reality, you can only do what you can do.
That's
why I wanted to raise it, because you've always got to understand the challenges of where you want to do the research.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, I really appreciate that, Kylie. That was a great presentation. What we might do is we can add your email to the bottom of your PowerPoint, send that back round, and that way, if anyone has got any further questions, they can get straight in contact with you. We will load this presentation up on the website, and please feel free, as we send the link around, to forward it to other people who might want to have a look at it. Because I think it's a really interesting discussion and a really important series of projects that you're involved in. So really appreciate you coming online. So last thing I just want to say is, and I'll stop the recording now so it's easier